There we go. So, all right, good afternoon, folks. Thank you for joining us for California Advancing PREA office hours. This is our letter writing workshop, and we'll do introductions next. My name is Jenica. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm a project coordinator here at Valor US. I've been here for almost 2 years, and I'll pass it to Layla.
Thanks, Janika. My name is Layla. I prefer they, them pronouns. I'm a program officer with Just Attention International. I'm relatively new staff to JDI, but I'm not new to the work. I was a rape crisis advocate for 2 years before that, and I'm a member of JDI's Survivor Council.
Awesome. And I see quite a few folks introducing themselves in the chat. Keep those intros coming. Would love to know what org you're from, what area you're in as well. Thank you for including that, folks. And your name and pronouns.
All right, great. So I feel pretty confident that most of us know how to use Zoom at this point, but I'll briefly walk us through what to expect from today's session. We have a short presentation for you, and we'll be spending time in smaller groups to have more intimate conversations as well. We encourage you to utilize the chat just like you're doing, and you can jump on the mic to participate too. So we've already got the chat started, and thank you so much for that. If you've yet to do so, please introduce yourself with your name, your pronouns, what RCC you're from, and also maybe how long you've been letter writing, just so we can see who's in the room with us and what your experience is today. And just again, a reminder, this space is really for you, so we want you to ask any questions that you might have throughout the session. All right, and again, I'm with Just Attention International, or JDI for short, and JDI is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. JDI's core goals are to work together with corrections officials, rape crisis centers, and policymakers to make detention facilities safe, change public attitudes about sexual abuse behind bars, and ensure that survivors get the help that they need. And our core principle is that it is our fundamental belief that when the government takes away someone's freedom, it takes on an absolute responsibility to protect that person's safety. No matter what crime someone has committed, rape is not part of the penalty.
Then I am here from Valor US, or Valor, formerly the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, or CalCASA. And here at Valor, we are committed to preventing and ending sexual violence by advancing equity and eradicating oppression. We provide leadership, vision, resources to rape crisis centers, individuals, community organizations, and other entities committed to ending sexual violence. Ultimately, what we envision is a world free from violence where the dignity of every person is valued and respected. And then we'll talk a little bit about our project overall. So if you have met with Layla and I, or Marcella and I, or Edward, or Yamila and I, or any one of the JDI Valor team, you've met with the California Advancing PREA team. So California Advancing PREA is a partnership between JDI and Valor, funded by the California Office of Emergency Services, or Cal OES. And then through this collaboration, what we hope to provide is local rape crisis centers with, resources and support and, thought partnership in order to help folks establish or improve or, build upon a full range of services to incarcerated survivors in California.
All right, and so we have a few objectives for today's session. One is to determine ways to assess the needs of incarcerated survivors via letter correspondence. Next objective is to provide strategies to build rapport, trust, and ongoing advocacy with incarcerated survivors. And finally, to describe the resources and healing materials available to address incarcerated survivors' needs. All right, so a good place to start with letter writing is to assess whether incarcerated survivors are able to access your agency via letter writing and what barriers might be present. Does your agency regularly receive letters from the facilities in your service area? Is your agency address accessible to incarcerated survivors? Do you already have an MOU in place with the facility to ensure letters between survivors and advocates remain confidential? Also, do incarcerated survivors have access to letter writing materials? And what that might look like is, for example, incarcerated survivors who are indigent might receive a few stamped letters from the facility, might vary by facility how often they receive that. And then they have to decide, are they going to use those letters for family? Are they going to those envelopes for family, for advocates, for other organizations? So it's just something to keep in mind as well. And the volume of letters your agency receives may speak to the accessibility of your agency's contact information within the facility. If your agency is receiving very few letters, it may be that survivors are not aware of your agency as a resource, or the facility may not be posting or sharing your agency information with survivors. So that might be an opportunity to brainstorm outreach options and how to ensure incarcerated survivors know that your agency is an available resource. And there are additional considerations in communicating with incarcerated survivors through email or other electronic means. Increasingly, incarcerated survivors have access to tablets, and communication over tablets is not necessarily confidential, but it may be a preferred method of communication for some incarcerated survivors since they can be utilized in their cells, which may generally be more private and accessible. So if a client insists on using a tablet to communicate with your agency, be sure that they know the potential lack of confidentiality and limitations and risks of using this method. We've also created some sample letters, which may reflect the content and urgency of letters from incarcerated survivors, and we will be dropping those in the chat. Note that these are not letters from actual survivors. It's just intended for education. Thanks, Jenica. So letters are an effective support tool advocates can provide to incarcerated survivors because they are confidential and a generally accessible mode of communication for incarcerated survivors. PREA standard section 115.53 provides that incarcerated survivors should have access to confidential support services from rape crisis centers, which includes the letter writing. If your agency has not yet set up services and an MOU with the facilities you're working with, be sure to communicate with facility staff about the importance of confidentiality and letter writing. Determine how letters will be addressed and kept confidential by facility staff. Each facility may differ in their approach to keeping letters with your agency confidential. Include this information in your MOU with the facility. And one example of that is in the photograph on this slide. There's an example of how letters between California Rape Crisis Centers and California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, or CDCR, facilities may be labeled with evidence code 1035.4 to ensure confidentiality. And although that evidence code applies to all communication between advocates and survivors, jails and other facilities may have specific rules on how they want their confidential mail addressed. So be sure to work with your facility on how to address letters and ensure the confidentiality will be maintained. Facilities are often concerned about contraband entering the facility through mail. Increasingly, facilities are shifting to electronic mail scanning practices to prevent contraband from entering, but often legal mail or confidential mail is not scanned and is delivered directly to the incarcerated person. Staff may insist that mail be searched and examined for contraband. Confidential mail should only be opened in the presence of the incarcerated survivor, checked for contraband, but not read. Additionally, mailroom practices can vary by state or facility, and staff may not always abide by mail confidentiality, unfortunately. So as an advocate, you may need to leverage your relationship with the facility in order to ensure mail between your agency and incarcerated survivors remains confidential. You might want to periodically ask clients if the mail they receive from you is being opened in their presence and if the confidentiality is being respected at the facility. and I'll pass it back to Jenica.
Always takes me a minute to get to the unmute button. And I just wanted to say, so we'll be dropping a number of links in the chat, but we'll also be posting this on the Valor website. Not only the recording, but all of the different links. So I know we can sometimes forget to grab the links that we want, but they'll all be in one spot once we get this posted. So I want to talk a little bit about different things to consider when setting boundaries. So um, when we're considering professional boundaries versus or professional letters versus personal letters, when we're having professional relationships and those client advocate relationships, our letters and those relationships really, they're time bound, there are clear roles, there's a clear or most of the time there's a clear beginning and end of your time in their life, right? Versus letters or a relationship that might be more personal, it's a little bit fluid, there isn't really a clear beginning or end. Roles might change over time, and there's just quite a bit more flexibility. And as an advocate, we have an obligation to maintain boundaries that guide that advocate client relationship. And doing so, hopefully, will allow our clients and the survivors that we work with to mirror those boundaries that we're setting, and that they can carry those into relationships that they have with professionals in the future, and will hopefully help them in the long run. Um, and, although our clients may not always explicitly focus on talking about the abuse or the specific, incident that happened or harassment that they've experienced, we may want to focus on other topics related to their recovery and healing. So that can mean talking about coping skills, talking about support system, brainstorming different strategies that foster healing, co-creating goals with someone related to learning those skills can help us kind of keep those goals in mind and keep that healing in mind as we're working with survivors. And then we want to be cautious about disclosing our personal survivor stories as a way to connect with clients or to illustrate a specific point. I oftentimes, we want to share in an effort to connect with someone, but that can kind of blur lines and cause a little bit of over familiarity depending on the situation. So if you notice yourself maybe slipping up a little bit, or you feel like your boundaries might be changing, take a step back and kind of take an inventory. Okay, what changed? Why do I feel a little bit um, differently? Why do I feel inclined to share more of my survivor story or overstep some of those boundaries? And really, the crux of that question is, what purpose would sharing a personal story serve? Is it my need to connect with someone because I relate to someone? Or will it help, the survivor overall feel a tiny bit less alone? Um, and just kind of sit in that a little bit before we want to share those stories. And then think about your options. Who do you have that you can talk to um, um, about wanting to share the stories or about wanting to overstep those boundaries? Who can you talk to that'll give you that real talk feedback? um and how can you stay within that scope of work, and then again maintaining those consistent fair firm boundaries. Survivors may ask you to mail letters or contact family members or public defenders, and um we'll need to effectively but compassionately, right, communicate that we're unable to. Again, survivors that we're in contact with oftentimes aren't able to talk to a whole lot of folks. They aren't able to reach out to their family members. They aren't able to, or maybe they've written their public defender and they haven't heard back for months on end. And, their resources are really, really limited and people are desperate. So of course someone's going to ask you about, can you contact this person? Can you contact this person? But it's important for us to keep those boundaries really clear and, you know, not, reach out to family members on this behalf or not reach out to, their legal team on their behalf. It gets a little bit murky at some points. It's also important that we set realistic expectations as an advocate, and that we're transparent about the way that your advocacy may not always have the intended results. For example, if you received the survivor's consent to reach out to this facility that they're in, for updates on their case, or in hopes of advocating for like a housing move. um, we all know just as much we all know that, there's not a guarantee that one of those things is gonna happen. There's not a guarantee that that housing move will happen. And there's even a small chance that there might be some retaliation that happens because they know that you're working with a rape crisis center. So being realistic about what you can do, and the amount of control that you have over the situation and what happens with the information once it gets shared is really important. We never want to overpromise anything. Um, if you find yourself, unsure of how to respond to certain questions, or experiences reaching out to your colleagues, you're also welcome to reach out to any one of us if you ever have any questions. If you've received a letter and you're like, I'm not even sure where to start with this, we're happy to talk things through with you. Um, let's see. Okay. We're going to take a minute. I see a lot of folks introducing themselves in the chat. Love it. Beautiful. We have folks all across the state, it looks like. Um, want to take a moment to kind of get a sense of folks, you know, and their experience in exchanging letters, communicating with survivors through letters, um, or if you're talking with survivors through emails on the tablets. Yeah, do we have a lot of seasoned letter writers here, or folks that have never written a letter before and they're just kind of dipping their toe in and trying to learn a little bit more? Feel free to share in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, go for it. Or maybe raise your hand and I'll unmute you so we don't have everybody unmuting all at once. Okay, see Megan, very new, dipping my toes in, as you said. Awesome. Beautiful. Okay, yeah, Cassandra says, I've not written a letter before, but I'm excited to learn. Sabrina, new but ready to dive in the deep end. Okay. Okay, Sabrina. Beautiful. Yeah, and then Corinda, I see that you raised your hand, so go ahead and unmute whenever you're ready.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, you're good.
I am new to my position as program director at my agency.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of taking over that letter writing role. So it's kind of exciting, but the letters that I've received so far, can't it's a survivor did not write that letter. It was more of mental health. Let's just say that.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Sometimes we'll get those off-topic letters.
Yes,
And
yes, yes.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I see you're from Safe Quest Solano, yeah? It looks like.
Yes. Yes.
Welcome. Glad you're
Thank you.
here.
Thank you
Yeah,
so
if you
much.
yes. We'll have our emails and stuff later on in the chat, but we'd love to connect.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Beautiful. Yeah, so we see a lot of new folks, and that's love it. We love to have new folks. Um, Love to hear folks feeling excited about letter writing. Like Corinda was saying, we can get off topic letters sometimes, um, but we also get letters that are really powerful, and oftentimes they're the only um, avenue of communication with incarcerated survivors. So it can be really important to your programming overall. Okay, Fatima is very, very new, a week into a new position, right on, but excited to learn. Congrats. Okay, well, keep those updates coming if you feel like it, but we're going to move on to the next slides here. So, what can we expect with letters? Letters can vary widely in length. Some letters can be a single sentence, such as, please send me a list of your services, or please add me to your mailing list. Other letters might be, really long. They might be kind of rambling. Sometimes the act of writing is a form of processing or kind of self discovery or self soothing for that survivor. Or it might be that it's their one shot to reach out for support, so they want to include as much information as possible. I can I can't even count how many times I received a letter that's, this thick that has their entire case and every single bit of information, times, dates, X, Y, and Z, because they want to make sure that we have all of the information. Letters may also include legal documents and other paperwork that someone shares with you. So you may want to brainstorm like with your agency about like how and where you want to store letters, like physically, like in the building. Like, is it going to be in this file room? How long are we going to keep them? And put together some policies around them. Some letters may not directly disclose sexual abuse or sexual harassment at all. Some might allude to it, but not state it directly. And others may, bury it or hide it in the middle of a letter that has multiple topics. And you might, receive letters that someone immediately discloses that sexual assault happened. And they place a huge emphasis on asking for, that support and that legal support, and that they need that support immediately. It can really, really vary. But what's important to remember is it may be really difficult for someone to feel safe enough to disclose within the first letter. So even if you receive a letter for someone from someone, it doesn't immediately discuss sexual violence or discuss the incident that happened with them. You'll want to respond quickly, respond promptly, and explain your role as an advocate, what your agency does, and how you can support them in your response. Help them feel safe. It's kind of like a hotline call that takes a long time to go back and forth a little bit. We want to set that tone for what someone can share with us. Um, so you may also get letters where the handwriting's really difficult to read and understand, or one that is in a language that's different than English. Think about and talk with, your leadership, or talk with your organization about, what is your plan if you need to translate a letter? What is your plan if, um, the letter's a little bit tricky to read? Um, you know, Not only are you thinking about how to read the letter that's in a different language, but how are you going to translate the letter that you're going to send back? You're going to need to have something, in place, or at least kind of some guidelines of who you're going to call, or who, you can reach out to. What service in your area can you pay to translate that letter? So on and so forth. Um, let's see. Oh, and then as kind of like a general note, if you are receiving letters and you kind of see a trend in things that are happening, or a trend in, we're receiving letters a month later than from when they're written, that's not really normal. Um, keep track of some of the common experiences that you're seeing, or some of the trends that you're seeing, and think about whether or not that's something you want to raise with the detention facility that you're working with. Of course, not specific information about, I received, this letter from Joe, X, Y, and Z, but, these trends that are happening, depending on your relationship with the facility, it might be something you want to bring up in the future. Okay, back to Layla.
Thank you. All right, so now we have some more tips for you in regards to the more practical aspects of letter writing. First, you will want to answer in a timely manner, and you should try to be brief in your letters while still addressing the writer's needs and concerns. Probably about 1 to 2 pages should be enough for starting out your letters. You'll want to use accessible language, and we recommend that you use an easy to read font, such as size 14. Or that the font should be an accessible font in size 14. As much as possible, we encourage you to match the writing of the survivor, but when you do not know their level of education, keep it to about a 6th grade reading level, and always aim for clarity in your language. The great thing about providing support via letter is that you can take your time, and the survivor has the opportunity to read your words carefully and turn to them again and again when they need a reminder that someone out there believes in them and cares about their well-being. And at the same time, there's no need to overthink your responses. You can just be thoughtful and remember the power of validating their experiences and making clear that the abuse that happened was not their fault. We recommend that you don't use form letters, but you may want to come up with some template language about your agency and your role as an advocate. Let the survivor know who you are and what you can and cannot do. And consider any additional information about limitations or confidentiality that you think should be included in your initial response. I'm sorry. It's also really important to note that incarcerated survivors who are transgender or gender nonconforming may have preferred names and pronouns which differ from their legal name. You'll want to be sure to address the letters to the survivor's legal name, and you can use their preferred name and pronouns in the body of the letter. Be sure to keep in mind that incarcerated LGBTQI+ survivors may not be out at their facility, and if they've requested any advocacy in the letter, that you confirm who they want information about their gender identity or sexual orientation shared with, if at all. It's also important to keep in mind that people who are incarcerated are accustomed to being ignored and to receiving responses that aren't helpful. So try not to add to that frustration. And that just means be clear, be consistent, set boundaries, don't make promises about outcomes, and respond within your capacity as an advocate. Maintaining a survivor-centered approach is an investment in earning the survivor's trust by leaving assumptions behind and acknowledging that the survivor is the expert in their journey and offering options rather than making decisions for them. I just want to also note that it can take additional time for incarcerated survivors to build trust with advocates because this is a community that has often had their trust violated time and time again by the support systems that are available to them. It's also important that any personal biases you may have about incarcerated survivors be identified and challenged. Those feelings are normal, but our job as advocates is to serve all survivors. When you're starting out, we recommend that you just skim through the entire letter and get a general sense of the type of support the survivor is looking for. And then you can go over the letter more carefully and make note of each thing that needs to be addressed. Are there safety concerns that require more immediate action, trauma symptoms to normalize, coping skills to offer, and additional resources to include? And then with your notes, you can create a simple outline to ensure that you're responding to all the relevant portions of the survivor's letter. You'll want to ask about their personal approaches to safety planning, coping mechanisms, and self-care, and offer approaches that would be relevant to their current circumstances. Of course, you're not going to know everything about those circumstances, so you should ask clarifying questions if necessary, while mirroring the language that they use to describe their experience. If it makes sense to do so, you can offer reporting options while explaining it is their decision whether they report or not, and your services are not dependent on it. The goal here is to provide ongoing care, so you're going to want to build rapport and trust by being honest, consistent, and caring. You can treat letters the same way that you would a hotline call or a one-on-one session. And as mentioned earlier, one of the cool parts about letters is that you have the opportunity to edit yourself and include those things that maybe you always wish you'd said in the moment when working with a survivor. As a best practice, you'll want to ask questions to invite an ongoing communication. And of course, you should thank the survivor for writing to you. Acknowledge that it takes so much courage to reach out for help, and let them know that you're looking forward to their response and that you're available for additional and ongoing support. You may also want to consider creating a packet of information to send to incarcerated survivors when they write to you. You can determine what resources might be the most helpful, but some ideas include a basic pamphlet of your agency's services, intake forms, a release of information form, an overview of the rights of incarcerated survivors, and available reporting options that make sense for that facility. It can also be really helpful to incarcerated survivors to provide self-care tips and coping resources specifically tailored to being in custody. You can also consider including lists of local resources, including reentry resources such as shelters, halfway houses, legal aid organizations, LGBTQ+ specific resources, and other community organizations which support incarcerated and reentering individuals. Often survivors may have requests which are beyond the scope of rape crisis centers, such as requests for legal assistance, disability rights, support for gender transition, or even pen pals. So it might be helpful to compile local, state, and national resources, which you can refer incarcerated clients to, like having a list of addresses they can write to for additional support on needs that are beyond what your agency offers. Other resources that might be really helpful to incarcerated survivors may include a copy of the PREA standards or even information on the statutes pertaining to the confidential relationship between survivors and advocates. Sometimes clients may write to you requesting very specific information, such as court cases or other information that may be unrelated to their experiences of sexual violence. And that's a great opportunity to establish a boundary and refer them to other resources and keep within the scope of the services your agency provides. Also, for reference, JDI provides state-specific resource guides to incarcerated survivors, and our website lists many of the resources provided in our printed guide. We're happy to share the guide with advocates as a resource to help you build your own packet of materials. You're also welcome to refer clients to us for a packet. However, we are not able to provide the same degree of emotional support as advocates at rape crisis centers. So we would refer them back to your agency for additional support. Also, if your agency would like to be included in our resource guide, if you're not already included, please let us know. And I will also drop my email in the chat and the resource for the JDI survivor guide. And I'll just go ahead and do that right now. All right, so you can feel free to reach out to me about that. Okay, and then just as mentioned with the packet, you'll want to provide options for coping skills and safety planning that make sense for a survivor in a detention center. This can be in the body of the response letter you're drafting or additional printouts of healing resources that you've prepared. For example, it might not be possible to help a survivor come up with a plan to avoid a perpetrator in a detention setting, as the survivor often has little to no control over their own movement within a facility. Also, if the perpetrator is staff or a gang member, reporting might not be a safe option for the survivor, just as going to the police for some communities can be more harmful than helpful. So let the survivor lead. They're the expert of their experiences, ask questions, and offer options. If someone shares that they're having trouble coping, offer things like progressive muscle relaxation, which doesn't require additional materials and can be done without calling attention to the survivor. You can also offer other forms of grounding, breathing, mindfulness, or even journal prompts. This particular form of support, letter writing, allows you to do a little research to find relevant resources and worksheets that would be beneficial. And there are good resources out there. We'll share some resources with you at the end of the webinar. We'll actually drop some right now. So you can always feel free to reach out to us if you would like ideas. If you've used additional coping skills that you've shared with survivors in detention through letters or even taking hotline calls or in other ways, feel free to drop those in the chat as well. If you have additional information, that would be really helpful. And I'll pass back to Jenica.
Awesome. Thanks, Layla. So now we're going to go back to, well, not really back to, we're going to talk a little bit about things that we want to consider when responding to letters. Layla kind of highlighted it earlier about kind of skimming the letter and getting a sense of, what kind of support they might need. But we have these key questions that we're going to be thinking about as we go through 2 examples, and we'll go through them as a group. So, the first bullet we have here is identify the problem or problems that you would hope to address in your response. Identify what the survivor is asking for support on. Describe what kind of emotional support you would provide. Identify what you can do and what your barriers are to helping them. identify how you, I'm sorry, yeah, identify how can you continue, gotta rewrite that, I'm so sorry. Continue providing ongoing support to survivors. And then we'll paste these in the chat as well. And so these are questions to kind of consider and think about as we're going over these examples. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to answer each and every question, but if one kind of jumps out to you as we're going through these examples here as a group. Okay. I just pasted those in the chat, and then we'll go through our first example. So this letter is written to a rape crisis center, and it says, I'm not sure who else to reach out to about this. I trust no one here. I need help. A few days ago, something happened with another prisoner. I feel dirty. I feel gross. I'm sorry. I feel dirty and gross. I feel like it's my fault that this happened. I do not know what to do, and I haven't told anyone about this. I want to report him, but I'm afraid. Can I even do that? I do not even have any proof, so is it even worth it? I also see him every day. Like, how am I supposed to live like this? So, um, yeah, as you're reading through this, if you receive this letter, what jumps out at you when you consider the questions that we placed in the chat? So if you're identifying, the problems that you would hope to address in that response, what would that be? And you can, put your answer in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, use the hand raising feature. Yeah, Megan says validating that it's not their fault and that feeling afraid and uncomfortable is understandable and must be a hard experience. Yeah, that emotional support. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, Sabrina says explaining the reporting process and options available to them. Yes, totally. Yeah, letting folks know what their resources are, letting folks know what their options are, just like you would on a hotline call or a walk-in. You might even, talk about some safety planning, engaging with them about, what safety planning could look like, because they mentioned that they see the abuser every day. And that looks a little bit different when someone's incarcerated. A lot of times it can look like having them identify safe people that they can walk around with, or having, really, it's more asking questions about their environment, and hoping that you can find somewhat of safety planning. It looks a little bit different though. Yeah, Megan says also sharing that reporting isn't required. Absolutely. But there are other options available too, though I'm not as well versed on those resources. Yeah, when we're talking about incarcerated folks, reporting is definitely not required. It's we're not here to encourage anybody and tell someone that they have to report, just with any other survivor. Um, as far as other options, they are pretty limited. It would be really difficult to request a VAWA exam without a PREA report being made, whether you want it or not. So it does get really tricky in that sense. It's one of those situations where once the information is shared with the facility, it might take on a life of its own, unfortunately. Okay, let's see. I think we've covered most of the questions here through our answers. What are some of the barriers? I think we talked a little bit about it, but what are some of the barriers that we have or that present themselves in this letter? Like, what would some of the differences be in the support that you're providing? Sabrina, I see your question here. If the assault happened within the window for an exam, would it be appropriate to attempt to reach them by phone? Um, I'm not sure I understand your question completely. If it happened within the window for an exam, we can definitely inform them about that. And if they're interested in an exam, we can with their consent, of course, we can talk to the facility about this person mentioned that they were assaulted and they're interested in an exam, and then go from there. We can talk to them about their own reporting options if they wanted to do that themselves, and encouraging them, or not encouraging them to do that themselves, but in most cases we want them to do that themselves. I think there are exceptions to that, if it's there are some exceptions to that. But did I understand
Yeah.
your question right?
Oh,
Go ahead.
oh
Yeah.
yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, like, that's a great point, Sabrina, and definitely wanting to provide that advocacy. I think just as Jenica mentioned, like there's just the questions around like consent, like it's not necessarily clear that we have like the consent to be contacting the facility about this survivor. And unfortunately, like with that time consideration and the turnaround around the letters, we may not be able to reach them like within that window. But that's a great point. And I think it would just be about like getting them their options as soon as possible around the report, and if that exam is still an option. But I think that's a really great question.
Thank you so much, Layla. For some reason I was not drawing that out of that question. Thank you so much.
You're good. Um, and then Megan also added that safety planning may be more difficult since this person has shared they don't have people who they consider part of their support system. That's a really great point, Megan. And just showing that like so many people in custody don't have other people that they can trust, other people they can talk to, including whether that's staff, whether that's peers. So that does make safety planning difficult. And that's where like you as an advocate can help step up as like, are we a resource for you? Can you call our hotline if you need someone to talk? We can set up counseling services for you. Like we can help fill some of these gaps like as a resource as well. But that's a great point around just so many of the challenges that exist for incarcerated survivors.
Thank you. Thank you, Layla. Thank you, folks in the chat. Um, Anything else that kind of sticks out for folks about this letter? Okay. As folks have thoughts, obviously feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll just circle back to them, but we'll move on to our next example. Okay, so this letter says, I filed a report after my assault last month, but nothing has happened and no one came to investigate or even speak with me. Now they're just telling me it's closed and unfounded. The CO that assaulted me still works in the unit that I'm stuck in. I have to see him every day. I can't sleep. I'm having nightmares about what happened. I feel really scared. I don't know what to do anymore. Can you help me? I need you to help me find out what happened to my report. Can you also talk to someone to see if I can move to another housing unit? Also, can you please contact my mom and tell her what happened? Okay, again, some of those questions that we want to be thinking of is, identifying the problem that you would hope to address in your letter when you write back. Identify what the survivor's asking for support on. What are they directly asking for? Describing what kind of emotional support we would provide. Identifying what you can do and what you can't do, what barriers are in place. And identify how you can continue providing ongoing support to the survivor. And there's a lot here, so I don't think that you have to capture all of them. If it's just one or two, that's okay. Yeah, it says multiple needs and requests, exactly. Reporting, follow-up, housing accommodation, connection to mother. The last request might be out of our scope. Yeah, that would generally be out of our scope. It would. But yeah, navigating those multiple requests. The reporting follow-up. Housing moves. And kind of the less explicit ask is that emotional support side of things. Because they're talking about not being able to sleep and having
Yeah.
nightmares and feeling really scared.
Yeah, definitely validating that trauma response that's happening with the nightmares. And Megan also adds, I may also validate that it could be really frustrating to see the report not be moved along. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great thing is, let them know, like, yeah, that is extremely frustrating. You made this report, you're expecting action to be taken, you're expecting to be able to be kept safe and have the report taken seriously. And we're really sorry to hear that that is not the case right now. That's a really good point. Does anything else stand out around being able to provide advocacy around some of these needs? Yeah, Sabrina, provide coping skills to help ease the anxiety. That is great, super helpful. Especially just considering the limited resources and how traumatic this experience has been and how it's impacting this person. Um, is there any other emotional support? Okay. I would ask if they would like advocacy with the institution to follow up on the report. That is awesome, Sabrina. Absolutely. Yeah, you can leverage your relationship with the facility. Ask if you can, as an advocate, reach out and, ask the institution about following up on the report, following up on getting this person's needs met. You might need to send a release of information along with the letter to be able to do that. And, you can communicate that in the letter, so that they know potential risks of reaching out and getting the advocacy, such as retaliation. But I think that that's a great way to advocate for this person. Yeah. Awesome. Any barriers that stand out to folks? Limitations on your role as an advocate? One thing that stands out to me is even though an advocate can reach out, yeah, that's a great point, Sabrina. Being assaulted by a CO, that can pose huge challenges with the institution following up. It can be dangerous. It can be dangerous to bring up. That person, can definitely face retaliation. Sometimes that can even challenge the relationship with your agency and the facility when you're bringing that up. That's a really great point. And often the institution protects its own staff. So that is an excellent point. Really great to communicate those safety concerns with the survivor, letting them know, like, we want you to be able to stay safe as much as possible while getting your needs met around potential reporting. Great. Really great work, you all. Another barrier is the limitations of an advocate. You might be asking for follow-up on the report or asking whether they can be transferred to another housing unit, but you can't make any guarantees. I mean, it's up to the facility to make those determinations. There may not be any leeway from the facility around supporting the survivor as you might want to. And then again, as already mentioned, communicating with this client's mother is probably out of scope. It might be an agency specific consideration. What would you do if this was the case for a survivor on the outside? Like, would you share information with a family member if they asked? Would signing a release make sense here? Or is this something that your agency wouldn't normally take on anyways? It might be an agency specific consideration as well.
All right. Yeah, feel free if folks have thoughts that come up, definitely feel free to chime in. We're coming almost to the end of our hour here, so we want to open things up for questions. If folks have them, feel free to use the hand raising feature or drop them in the chat. And then I'll pass it back to Layla.
Thank you. Yeah, while you think of your questions, we'll just go over some additional resources. So there are a lot of answers to questions you may have on the JDI and Valor websites, as well as the PREA Resource Center, which is a tool that we ourselves turn to often for clarification and more information. You can also reach out to us at any time with specific questions about this work or to be connected with agencies doing similar work. And I think, as mentioned, Jenica and I, we do one-on-one coaching with rape crisis centers. So we're here to support you and talk you through any challenges.
I'm going to see a question in the chat about, is there an option for emailing versus mail? So at this point, most facilities, if not all, or many incarcerated folks have tablets. They don't get them all the time. They have them for certain windows, and there's a lot of monitoring, and they're not confidential. That being said, we do know that some folks prefer to use email versus mail, even though they know that it's not confidential for a number of reasons. So that's something to really discuss, internally at your agency, if you're wanting to receive emails from incarcerated survivors, or survivors in general, right? Not every agency does that due to confidentiality and the risks that having that confidential information via email poses.
Another question from Sabrina: what is the typical timeframe delay in receiving of letters after sent? That's a great question, and I think it can really vary depending on the jurisdiction, depending on the facility. Like, we hear that, I mean, sometimes there's like, talking about letters like we receive from facilities, there might be weeks from when that person hands the letter off to be mailed, and then by the time it reaches our facility. And so there might be a similar, like, additional turnaround time of weeks. It could be days, it could be weeks. I think it really just depends, like, on the type of facility, the volume of mail, mailroom practices. So it's hard to say. I think you would probably get a sense for that as you build the relationship with the facility, like looking at the turnaround times. I think most incarcerated survivors who write letters are very good about dating things because they're aware of gaps in time. So you might be able to see like, okay, it takes 5 days or it takes 2 weeks, and then you can kind of gauge like how the like the frequency of the correspondence and how it's getting through. Okay, and Megan is asking, do you have any tips, guidance on facilitating a letter writing gathering event or program? Thinking about something like this, link from Survived and Punished. I understand this question falls a bit outside of the workshop's focus on PREA advocacy, so totally okay if you don't address this. Um, I would say on like since we are speaking specifically around PREA and confidential mail between advocates, I'd say if you were going to do a gathering, you would want all of the people doing the gathering, if you're answering survivor letters, to be advocates or have done like a volunteer training, done like the state mandated training to qualify as an advocate. Because that's the only way to guarantee that the mail is confidential and that you're abiding by the confidentiality. You have the training to respond to letters around sexual assault. If you were doing something like it, I mean, it's kind of outside the scope of this training, but if you're doing something in the community that was just for incarcerated folks in general, I'd say, that's a whole different conversation. I hope that answers things. Jenica, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I think you really hit the nail on the head there. You can definitely, I think, in smaller groups within your agency, or if you have volunteers, let's say you get uh, a handful of letters, scheduling some time that same week to say, hey, let's all get together and respond to these letters together, and kind of having like a responsive event, if that makes sense. Um, with advocates only, I think would be something you could do. First of all, Survived and Punished, amazing. Love them, really support all of their work. Um, but we also do know, organizations um, provide support in general for incarcerated folks, like Layla was saying. So if have an event in that regard, and it's not responding directly to letters that you've received from incarcerated survivors, it might look a little bit different.
Yeah.
And Megan, we're also happy if you want to email us, and I'm going to drop our emails in the chat. We're happy to
Yeah.
kind of brainstorm what that could look like too, and considerations.
Thanks.
We'll set up a call with you too.
Um, Awesome. Really quick, I also thought like JDI, we do holiday cards, which like we have people from the community volunteer to write these holiday cards because they're cards and they're just providing like general supportive messages. So that might be something you could take on, but please do reach out to us. And Sabrina also asks, have institutions been relatively receptive to letter writing programs? Um, I'm not sure about what you mean by letter writing programs. Do you mind clarifying? Do you mean just receiving letters between rape crisis centers? Okay. Um, I'd say it's under that PREA standard. I think it was 115.53 around providing the confidential services. Like that is generally understood that letter writing is one mode of communication with the Rape Crisis Center. So they must provide that avenue, that survivors can access the Rape Crisis Center through letter writing. And I think generally when agencies are entering into MOUs, they are able to communicating. Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Kelly. Letter writing is specified in our MOUs. Exactly. Like a lot of times the agencies set up those MOUs. We provide the hotline, we provide the letter writing, explaining these are confidential services. So generally, I think it's understood that it's like they must provide access to the rape crisis centers. That doesn't mean mailroom staff are always going to be respectful. That doesn't mean, there aren't violations that happen, but the institutions themselves like have to be able to support that access.
Mhm.
Great questions, y'all. Thank you.
So I know we're going a little bit over, but I want to throw a couple links in the chat as Layla chats about them.
Yeah, we've got these links. We've got the JDI webpage that contains the bulk of the trainings that we've developed between JDI and Valor over the past years, which speaks specifically around honing advocates' expertise around work and detention. So that's a great resource. And then we also have a feedback survey around these office hours. So if you would like to fill that out, that would also be super helpful.
Yeah, the feedback survey is pretty short and sweet. So it's really helpful for us to know what's working about these presentations, what's not, what people loved, what people were not super excited about, and helps us tailor our trainings to y'all in the future. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, folks. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, our emails are in the chat. Drop them one more time. I'll try to drop them one more time, but feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, if you want to set up a call. People are always like, we never want to bug you. It's literally our jobs to answer questions. It's literally our jobs to strategize and talk about how to build up your programs or how to support survivors that are incarcerated. So please, please,
Yeah.
please reach out to us.
Please, we want to hear from you. Reach
Yes.
out to us.
All right. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, folks.